to the ZOiS Lecture Series, What Social Science Tells Us or Has Told Us About Ukraine. My name is Gwendolyn Sasse. I'm the director of the Center for East European and International Studies, ZOiS, in Berlin. And I've organized this lecture series in cooperation with Humboldt-Universität in Berlin. And tonight, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Tetiana Kostiuchenko. And we will be hearing about social capital in Ukraine, networks and civic activism. I think in some ways, tonight's lecture will build on previous lectures in this series, given by Oksana Mikheeva and Olga Onuch, for example, but there will also probably be increasing links to other lectures as we move along in this series. And also to say it right away at the beginning, we're recording these lectures and we're creating an archive of social science research on Ukraine with this lecture series. So look around also for the other lectures in this series. And tonight's speaker, Dr. Tetiana Kostiuchenko, is a lecturer in sociology in the sociology department of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And currently she's a fellow at the Free University here in Berlin, where she is part of the cluster of excellence that is called the Contestations of the Liberal Script, in short, Scripts. This excellence cluster is funded by the German Research Foundation. And Tetiana has worked on a wide range of topics. She's interested in elite dynamics, in the role of parties, in businesses, also different gender aspects tied to these topics. But I think it's fair to say that her key focus in recent years has been on the study of social networks and social capital. And she uses social network analysis to get into these issues. She's published widely, for example, in journals, in English-speaking journals, or English language journals like Historical Social Research or Europe-Asia Studies, but she of course also has a long list of publications in Ukrainian. And I also want to point out that she was a member of the national research team at the public opinion agency InfoSapiens that implemented the World Value Survey in 2020 in Ukraine. I'm very grateful that you're participating in this lecture series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gwendolyn. Thank you for arranging this series on Ukraine. And I'm grateful for raising the interest to different topics and allowing us, social scientists, to present our research findings and generate the discussion on contemporary Ukrainian society. So I will share the slides now. Yes. Do you see the slide? Yes.
It's working, yeah.
Mm-hmm. As Gwendolyn mentioned, during recent years, I focused my research attention on the networks, mainly the political networks and business networks. But in the recent years, this research interest broadened into the studies of the social capital of the, let's say, wider public. And I explored what kind of instruments can be applied into studying the social capital and the, this wide public level. Because for those of you who might have the experience of working with the social network analysis, or if you don't have such experience, but well, you saw the graphs, for example, of the networks, you can imagine that it's quite hard to draw such a network graph for the whole population. However, there are some instruments, as I discovered, that allow to measure the social capital on the wide public level and allow for the finding some interpretations on how this social capital structure can affect, for example, civic activism or the other processes in public life. So very briefly, what was the research framework for social capital studies? I would say that there are at least two approaches that are different, and one of them goes back to Putnam's explanations and interpretations of social capital as the interpersonal trust, interorganizational trust, participation in various organizations, including the civil society organizations and different services and different volunteering groups, community organizations. That is one approach, and actually widely applied approach that has been popular in different population polls, and the data that we can obtain from these population polls is also available for Ukraine, and it is available in various surveys, in various opinion polls, and I will show some slices of this data in a few minutes. However, I was more on the positions of the network analysis, and for me it was important to trace actually the network perspective in studying social capital, specifically what is the structure of personal and community networks, and what kind of resources one can reach or mobilize through direct and indirect ties, through strong and weak ties, for example. And there is some literature on that in the network analysis approach. I will give some references further on that literature. And apparently this data was not really available on Ukraine, for Ukraine until 2019. So that was actually problematic to measure social capital through the network perspective. Not problematic to measure, but the data was not available. So the instruments were elaborated already, and there were the survey results for some countries, but not for Ukraine. What actually was available before the full-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine? The available surveys were covering a broad range of topics, including the participation in different kinds of organizations, trust to these organizations, the civic activism level, the interpersonal trust changes. And here I give some of the examples of these nationwide opinion polls, including the World Values Survey already mentioned, and the Civic Engagement Poll, the national poll that is conducted for the Engage project funded by USAID. It has been conducted since 2013 till now. So there is the data available in dynamics that we can actually compare what changed, and if it changed whether, for example, the civic activism level increased or decreased, or what might affect it. And there was also the survey of the International Social Survey Program, ISSP. Actually, Ukraine was included to this survey project, which is conducted on annual basis in 2009 and in 2019. Thanks to the efforts from the Institute of Sociology of the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and in particular our colleagues also, Professor Svetlana Oksamitna. This survey is about the social stratification. The survey topics were about social stratification, not specifically about social capital or civic activism, but there were some of the questions that allow tracing the willingness of people to make contacts with the other people in different domains. So I will show some of the data results from these surveys. And again, basing on the approach from the Putnam's concept of social capital, the wide social capital means that people, wider public, actively participates in different organizations, in different civil society organizations or voluntary organizations. And as we see for Ukraine, actually, these figures, the number of the active and non-active members of such organizations actually increased. As it is shown, it is revealed in the World Value Survey. The membership, both active and non-active membership in different kinds of organizations, increased since 2011 to 2020. So 2011 means that that was the wave 6 of the World Value Survey that was conducted in Ukraine before Euromaidan, before the start of the war in Donbass and the annexation of Crimea. And 2020 covers actually the events which were in the start of the COVID pandemic. So lots of different processes might affect the society, and including the membership in organizations. But here it's just the illustration how one might make the conclusion that the social capital in Ukraine actually increased since 2011 to 2020, just basing on this membership in organizations, formal membership in different organizations. However, as the civic engagement poll shows, the core of these active members did not change a lot during 2017-2020. In particular, so this survey, as I mentioned, is conducted regularly since 2013, and I'm showing here just a few waves of this survey. 6 waves since conducted between 2017 and 2020. And as the scale in this question, did you participate in civil society organization activities during the last year, covers different options of participation: participated actively, participated rarely, did not participate because of the lack of time, and did not participate because of the lack of interest. We can see that this share of those who actually participated actively is rather stable during 2017-2020. Well, basically, it's similar with the share of those who participated in the CSO activities rarely. So comparing with the previous slide, we can see that the formal membership might show us that the social capital actually increased. But if we look at the other data, we see that it's hard to conclude that anything changed in the participation, in the membership, and in the participation of the activities of CSOs. The other angle that the available surveys cover is the topic of trust, and the trust as interpersonal trust and interorganizational trust, or institutional trust, we can say. So how people actually assess or evaluate their level of confidence in different kinds of organizations, groups, or institutions. And here I'm showing also the data from World Value Survey, and apparently the only organizations that experienced the rise of trust from the public are the education and environmental organizations from 2011 to 2020, but actually the level of confidence to the organizations did not change considerably, and that also raises up the question on why people actually became members of different organizations, as we saw in the first slide. So why the membership increased, why people started to become active or non-active members of different organizations. It might be also compared with the data from the civic engagement poll, and we see that the confidence in different types of organizations increased between 2017 and 2018, including civil society organizations, and also, and I think this differentiation is important here in this specific poll, is that it differentiates volunteer organizations, civil society organizations, and individual activists or informal communities of activists. So here we see that the trust to volunteer organizations actually increased much more than the trust to civil society organizations, and it actually is higher. It was higher in 2018 than the trust to civil society organizations and their members. And going deeper into this data, one might find that it also, among other reasons, it's because people actually interacted in person with the volunteer organizations and volunteers, and getting some assistance, some help from these organizations. And this interpersonal interaction might be the driver for the increase of trust. If we cover this issue of interpersonal trust, again, coming back to world value survey, we can see that it increased. Well, it increased for Ukraine. In Ukraine, from 23% to, well, almost 28.5%. During these 9 years between 2011 and 2020, and it's although it's lower than in the Scandinavian countries or in some Northern European countries, it's still higher. It was higher in 2020 in Ukraine than, for example, in Slovakia or Czech Republic or Croatia, or even Poland. Yes, so that means that Ukraine, in this respect, in terms of how the wider public perceives the readiness to trust to other people around, that we are at, let's say, at the similar level with most of the Central Eastern European countries. So we cannot conclude that Ukrainians are suspicious towards the surrounding. Yes, so people perceive other people in Ukraine as those who can be trusted to similar extent as people in most of the EU member states that are showed on the slide. So. For my research, this data was not fully sufficient, so I still felt that there is a lack of the indicators on which specific ties people can rely on. So for me, this data on, for example, that people can be trusted, most people can be trusted, that is just the let's say, broad picture, and I really felt the need to go deeper into the interpersonal surrounding of the respondent, and to cover different types of ties, different types of goals that the person might be able to implement, to reach through the closest surrounding. And here I will give some a short overview of how the social capital concept is covered in the social network analysis perspective. So the difference is that we really need to refer to the resources that the ego actor, meaning the respondent in the survey, can get through the strong and weak ties, through the surrounding, through the alter actors. And we might specify different goals, we might specify different types of resources, we might specify different positions of the alter actors, and depending on the research question, we can cover both resources as instrumental, as resources that allow the ego actor to reach the instrumental goals and or the expressive goals. And there is some literature that suggest the explanations of how the social capital should be studied, should be explored. And during 90s and early 2000s, it was published by different authors, by James Coleman, by Ron Bird, by Nan Lin, and in all these papers and all these publications, there is this link between the social capital as connections, as the ties, the personal ties of the actor, of the ego actor, ego respondent, and the closest surrounding. And some authors also specify that we need to focus on the social structure that is formed by this closest surrounding, meaning that the different types of the social structure around the person might provide different access to the resources. And the relational structure actually matters when we study, for example, why some people are more successful than the others, why some people are more important for example, for information dissemination or for the other community goals, for example, for joining the community in order to implement some kind of an initiative. In early 2000, some works appeared that pointed out on the shadow side of social capital that the closest surrounding also not only give us the access to resources, but also put some constraints on us, because some actions, some goals become not available anymore because the surrounding interfere to the attainment of these goals. And this is an interesting direction of studies of the social capital, I think, because in the previous works, and especially in the works of Bird and Lin, the social capital was referred to more as the, let's say, in a positive way, but not in the way that it might interfere some of the collective actions. As I will refer to the concept of strong and weak ties, I think it's important to mention Granovetter's work. And well, some of you might heard about Mark Granovetter's concept of the strength of weak ties. And for those who didn't, in a few words, the work that Granovetter published in the 70s pointed out that not only the strong ties of a person are important, and for some goals, for some activities of a person, the weak ties might become even more important. And that's how he actually discovered that the weak ties, for example, for the job search, which was in the focus of his research, for the job search, the weak ties are more important than the strong ties. So in his study, and also the research findings that I will share with you in a few minutes. The notion of strong ties meant that these ties are the direct ties, they are emotionally full, they are with people with whom we interact very often, we rely on these ties, we trust to these ties much more than to the weak ties, perhaps. However, these kind of connections do not allow the new information to come to our social circle, to our closest social circle. Because the relatives and close friends usually have the similar views, similar values, similar attitudes to different social events, to different public events. So they have similar knowledge of, similar knowledge to us. And of course, these ties are important for social support, for emotional support, but they also result in getting some kind of a biased information, because if we do not get the diverse information from different kinds of social circles of other people, that means that we are in our bubble, let's say. Yes, this term became popular when these studies of misinformation and fake news flourished in the recent years, and this information bubble is something about our social circle, and this boiling of information in our closest surrounding, that we all talk about the same things in the same way. And as Granoveta pointed out, the weak ties are, if they are, for example, if they are rare, they are indirect, they allow better access to different information and new information in particular. And as he studied the job search and how people, what were the people's strategies in searching for a job, and which strategies were more efficient for the applicants, for those who were searching for a job. It came out that the weak ties were more efficient, and they brought better information about better job opportunities. And thus, Granoveta concluded that weak ties are a better form of social capital, in particular for career attainment. Of course, this study conducted in the 70s in the US was then followed by the other studies, and some of the works appeared further, like the strengths of strong ties, the weakness of strong ties, and so on. But that kind of those conclusions that Granoveta made, and that kind of emphasis on the weak ties brought up the attention to studying the social capital through this perspective of what kind of the structure of connections a person has, and how the person actually addresses different kinds of ties with regard to different kinds of needs or goals in her or his life during lifetime, and how that actually changes during the lifetime. So the idea of this structure of social capital is very visible when you look at the graphs, on the network graphs. And so for comparison, the concept of closure that was emphasized by Coleman is about the importance of high cohesion also the concept that became quite popular in Ukraine during recent years, studying the social cohesion, studying the group cohesion, and referring to this concept of social cohesion. So in Coleman's work, the closure and high cohesion is important for the social trust, it's important for social capital, and strong ties actually foster this interpersonal trust. And the closure means that people are bonded by the lots of ties in a group, highly dense, highly connected groups with a high density level. And the works of Coleman were then confronted, I would say, with the research developed by Ron Bird, that not only closure is important, so for kind of local goals or local activities, the closure is important, of course, but for the meso level, for community level, for let's say the settlement level, for example, if there are any kind of the activities on the settlement level, municipal level, the brokerage is important. And the brokerage means that there are people who serve as brokers through their maybe weak ties with these closely connected communities, closely connected groups that have the high density level. But these brokers are crucial for the network, because through these brokers who actually fill in the structural hole, so to say, the concept that Bird suggested, these brokers make the whole network active, make the whole network linked into one network. And they also enable different parts of the network to interact. Either it's the exchange of material resources or non-material resources. Of course, there could be brokers inside these communities when a person in the community become the broker with the other person in the other community, because they form this tie between each other. So Bird studied these kind of structures and the structural holes and the brokerage and in different aspects, in the aspects of not only the job search, but for example, entrepreneurial activity and the spread of new ideas and innovations in the communities. However, this study of showing how, for example, the weak tie is formed between two communities, it's not actually applicable to the population, to the survey as a population poll. When we have the probability sampling, we do not survey the network actors as a community. Yes, we actually pick up respondents in these different communities basing on some kind of a sampling frame, and the goal of the population poll is to make this scanning of all the possible communities, yes, of different stratas, different categories of the population. So I was searching for this kind of instrument that would allow to measure the social capital through the network perspective, but with the being applicable to the population polls. And I found the different instruments actually developed by the group of researchers in the Netherlands, and they called these instruments, these tools, the name generator, resource generator, and positions generator. And the one that I picked up for the goals of my research is the resource generator. It's basically the list of the different possible resources that one might get access to through the personal ties. For example, there are some people in our surrounding that can repair a car or a bike, that has an own car, that can repair durables and some household appliances, or play a musical instrument, and so on. And for my research, I used some of the resources that were in the Dutch survey. But for Ukrainian realities, I also, adopted it to some extent. For example, there was the healthcare reform in Ukraine after 2014. And I was wondering to what extent people actually appeal to their closest surrounding in getting some kind of a healthcare consultation, advice on own health. And also, there were other reforms that were going on in Ukraine since 2014. And for example, I was wondering whether there is anyone in person surrounding who works in the, who knows a lot about tax system or works in a tax service, because some of the public opinion polls conducted before 2019 were showing that Ukrainians are not so well informed about the tax system. And for example, there is a very small percentage of those who actually understand how their salaries are structured in terms of the taxes. So how much of their gross salary is paid as taxes, because people are more guided with the net salary than the gross salary. Also, some other interesting resources are in this list. Well, interesting in my perspective, and I think it's important to measure that when we talk about the social capital in Ukraine. These are the links through the personal surrounding to, for example, public authorities or local authorities, to media experts or journalists. That's here, the person who works in a mass media channel as a journalist or editor. So I think that it is very important when we study the media literacy, and when we study the trust or mistrust to different information sources. Of course, this resource access to political parties, it was present in the Dutch survey, and I kept it in the survey for Ukraine. The respondents were asked whether they have anyone among their contacts who can provide the access to the specific need or resource, and there was this list of 19 resources. Respondents had to pick up one of the options in the scale, whether they have a relative, a friend, a neighbor, acquaintance, or none, who can provide the access to the following. That is, I mean, I'm aware of the fact that it's not covering the whole ego network. However, if the person has the access to, for example, someone who has shares of a company or joint venture, and this is the relative, this is like the access to this specific resource, or the information about the how the company functions for the owner, for the shareholder, through the strong tie, either than through the acquaintance, for example, who might not be so open about different information. And the same refers to the other kind of resources. So it's actually scaled from the strongest connection to, let's say, the weakest, because, well, with the neighbors, it's still tricky whether to consider it to be a strong tie or a weak tie, because of course there are the neighbors who are our friends, but in this, I rely on the respondent's answer that if a respondent talks about a friend, that means that even if it's a neighbor, but this person is considered as a friend. But if the person picks up the answer neighbor, that means that it's somehow more distant than a friend. And the same refers to the acquaintance. So acquaintance is the distant tie. So it's not the close, strong connection of the respondent. And these are the results from the 2019 opinion poll. So yeah, I have to say a huge thank you for my colleagues in InfoSapiens who agreed to include this instrument to actually to try this approach for measuring social capital in the Omnibus survey, and it was first included in the Omnibus in August 2019. Basing on these results, we see that the highest success among all the resources is to those who own a car or can repair a car or a bike, and also who can do shopping, for example, when the person is ill, or who can provide some kind of help for relocation or a place to sleep overnight. So most of these resources that are very accessible, I would say, they are the resources that describe the personal needs, the private life of a person. But there are also the resources that are in the public life, that lie in the public life of people. For example, the political party. With the political party, we see that the share of those who has none among their closest surrounding who participates in the political party actively is almost 75%. So it means that out of 4 respondents, only 1 would say that yes, there is someone among my surrounding, in my surrounding, who actively participates in the political party. And the similar results are for some of the material economic resources. For example, earning at that time in 2019, I would say that this would be quite a high amount of money per month. And there is correlation on how much the respondent actually earns, and whether he or she has someone in their surrounding who earns this kind of income per month. But what is, I think, also interesting is this access to information from media, because there is very, well, not high, quite a low, I would say, even share of those who has someone among their surrounding who works in mass media channel as a journalist or editor. And when I included this last line, can speak and write in Chinese, I was not aware of the COVID-19 that would come up very soon, but it came out that this specific resource became relevant in the next years, and through this I would say perception of knowing this language, maybe knowing the culture, knowing the Chinese society, people also get some news about the COVID. So how it changed through the time? It changed somewhat in 2020, and here I show the aggregated figures for all the types of ties, including relatives, friends, acquaintances, and neighbors. And as you can see, for 2020, when the pandemic was when we all experienced the results of the pandemic with reducing our physical interactions with other people, it actually had the effect on the results of the survey, except for, and it's quite interesting, except for being an expert about football, and it even increased in 2021. And also lending considerable sum of money. Also, people probably investigated whom they can ask, whom they can ask for this resource among their surrounding. And also, if to compare 2021 with 2019, I did that on purpose, so I'm not comparing 2020 with 2019 in a very specific way, or 2021 with 2020, but I was more wondering about whether any kind of the resources became either reached the similar level as in pre-pandemic time in November 2021, or maybe even exceeded the level of 2019. And it's observed for some types of resources, and among them is, for example, the lending money, giving a job reference, working in the public authority or local authority, earning more than 50,000 hryvnias per month, and knowing a lot about tax system, working in the tax service. And what ties actually contribute to the social capital increase. So I will show it for 4 types of resources, whether it's relatives or friends or neighbors or acquaintances. So with lending considerable sum of money, it's more about the relatives and to some extent about neighbors. In 2020, comparing to 2019, we do not see any kind of increase for neighbors, but we see the increase for relatives, and we see even high increase for relatives in 2021 and increase for the neighbors. As for the job reference, we see the increase for neighbors as well, and I would call it so when I discovered this result, this outcome, I call it the post-COVID effect, when people actually stayed at home and well, had to communicate with the neighbors in a more active way. They also exchanged information about each other, and that includes the information about the employment, about job. So I would say that this increase in the appealing to neighbors, or being able to appeal to the neighbors in these specific types of resources, is the effect of probably the staying at home and being in a better capacity to know our neighbors in a more extensive way. And about 2 other resources, knowing about the tax system and working in a public authority or local authority. Here we see more the effect of the relatives and friends, and to some extent the neighbors as well. And also for the public authority, the friends and the neighbors. So the friends since 2020, and for the neighbors in 2021. So what outcomes we can get from these comparisons. So of course, this is the work in progress, and I will go deeper into the data and into the comparing or the different age group, different income groups, and different types of settlements. So there is some ideas in the literature on social capital that the social capital structure differs for people in the smaller towns, smaller settlements and villages than for the people in the bigger settlements and big cities. And this is just the very top of the data set. So just two outtakes on this research and this data comparison is that higher access to various resources is observed for the ties with neighbors, which are considered to be weak ties. And it's actually put the question whether we can still consider them to be weak ties, or we can say that some of them became stronger due to the fact that people know their neighbors better and know more about their neighbors and maybe trust more to their neighbors. So my question would be whether this creates any potential for the community activism, for the joining efforts in some local initiatives, and not only in terms of creating OSBB, for example, but also some kind of activities on the neighborhood watch or the so what we observed, for example, just in the very first days of the full-scale invasion, at least in the house where I spent the first 2 weeks in Kyiv, when the neighbors in one house joined their efforts in monitoring the situation, in observing the situation in the neighborhood, and the guarding the house, guarding their common property, I would say, and also cooperating with the territorial defense units. And the other question is about the friends and relatives and the strong ties. So for some of the resources, we see that the access to these resources became higher through relatives and friends. And among other issues that it rise up, the question is whether it might, for example, for authorities and the public, create some better opportunities for communication and for non-biased communication, for rather not so formal communication. And here I do not mean the opportunities for some kind of corruption or the bribing, rising of bribes, but I rather mean that the authorities, especially the local authorities, can work closer with the wider public in the settlement and talk the understandable language, the common language with the citizens in the settlement. That would be on the basis of mutual trust between the public and authorities. However, there is the other angle of that, whether it creates the threat for misinformation and fakes, because from the other surveys that cover the issues of the access to information and news about the events in Ukraine, about the events in their own settlement, respondents often put the friends as one of the most important resources of news. So not for example, such media channels as radio or, of course, newspapers, but friends and relatives appear in the top 3, in addition to TV and the social media and internet. Of course, that means that if we have a high level of trust with the relatives and friends, and the information or news comes through this channel, would not be that situation when we trust the fake news because it came from the trustworthy channel, and how actually to work with that. And that's, of course, the open question for different initiatives that work in the media literacy domain. And here I would stop, and I'm open for your comments and questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tetiana, for this very wide-ranging talk. Maybe you could stop sharing your screen, then I think the view is a bit easier again for everybody. Perfect. Thanks. And please, yes, I already put it in the chat, add some questions, comments in the chat. I think the first ones are coming in. If I could just sort of clarify one thing with you, because you started by focusing on the one hand on putting up data on civil society organizations, and then that is often contrasted with or not contrasted, but it's an additional element to look at volunteering, and you put volunteer organizations. And I was just wondering how either in that surveys or how you sort of draw the distinction there. And I'm also wondering for people answering questions in surveys, is it so obvious where a volunteer organization stops and a civil society organization begins? Sort of, or would it be maybe more appropriate to take volunteering without necessarily that organizational dynamic, if that was partly, I think, what you were referring to? And that's just sort of one question. And the next one, I was wondering on the distinctions between kind of the weak ties and strong ties. I worked on something related to that also in the migration field, and in the end, it always came down to well, weak and strong ties is such a compelling term, or compelling terms, but ultimately, where do you draw the line? No, and when you talked about neighbors, are they really kind of weak ties? Maybe not. But could they also fall into the category that you, I think, interestingly introduced into the discussion about brokers? No, are they maybe kind of the actor that you put out there could be, or is needed a broker to link different ties? That was just an idea, but maybe you start with that, but then I pick up questions from the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Gwendolyn. So as for the volunteering and civil society organizations, that was not my distinction, but that was brought by the project into the survey, by the Engage project, into this civic engagement poll. And this distinction, I think, comes from the perception of the CSO as the formalized organization that might work. I mean, people in the CSO work on the basis of being paid for that. So they are employed by the CSO. Yeah, so they work as employees, although in a non-profit sector. But with volunteer organizations, it perceived, perhaps I would say, as people who can contribute on unpaid or maybe less paid basis to some kind of a help, assistance, or advising, or well, something else. So that's just possible explanation why these two alternatives were distinguished. And I'm just finding interesting how differently it's perceived by the respondents. So as for the brokers, it's definitely the position in the network that attracts the attention in different types of topic studies and migration studies as well, when the brokers are either those from the host community or those who come, for example, with the earlier waves of migration, and they become brokers between the host community and the migrant community. But I think that for the population pool, it might be hard to to pick this kind of brokers. So we can do that when we study a specific community. For example, a certain, even not a settlement, but a certain district, I would say, or a certain organization or a certain sphere. And thus we would have this as the research objective, yes, to depict these brokers and to characterize them. So who are these brokers, whether as individuals or as organizations or as some kind of intermediaries, yes. In the population poll, as I tried to implement it, with this resource generator, I think that it might be the case with those who have access to lots of resources, because if we go back to this idea that our closest surrounding would not give us a very diverse resource, if it's, for example, the diverse well, out of, let's say, 19 resources, the respondent has access to, I don't know, at least a half of them, and it's mostly not through the relatives or friends, but through the acquaintances, it might be perceived as a broker because it's rather weak ties than the strong ties. But here, I think what I will be doing further with this data is actually this categorization of every respondent, and it's also possible to do this comparison of the ego network of each respondent, and thus making some kind of a clustering of respondents into these specific groups like non-brokers or brokers. But yeah, thanks for the idea.
Thank you. I pick up a question related to the ties and the different ties. Larissa is asking why you didn't include colleagues as part of the ties. I don't actually know if you did include them. Maybe they were part of one of the categories. And she says maybe the role of colleagues actually in terms of access to resources is substantial and could have also increased during the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, a very simple answer, because I was guided with this tool developed by the colleagues in the Netherlands, and from my knowledge, there was this kind of scale that they used, and that would be interesting to include colleagues. But I think that there is also a well, might be problematic, because we have here in the types of resources that are job related, and it's, I would say, rather obvious that colleagues would come up there, for example, the job reference, or I don't know, some kind of like tax or legal advice, yes, tax advice. So it might affect the results as well, and in these kinds of resources, colleagues would be well, obviously overwhelming, because if it's colleagues, for example, the accountant in the enterprise or in the organizations, that the person whom you might address in getting the tax consultation, I would say, or a legal advisor at your organization. So I think that is perhaps the reason why the Dutch team did not have it in the scale. That's just my assumption.
Thank you. Tamara put two questions in the chat. Let's start with the one about gender aspects to the research findings. Did you come across those, or have you looked at those already?
I had briefly, but yes, I did not include that into the slide. It's there are two insights that I can recall in my memory when working with this data in the comparison by gender. For male respondents, there were like higher access to these economic resources, which was rather expected. And also with such kind of gendered practices like being competent in football. So among their surrounding, there are more people who can, whom they can consider competent in that. And if I'm not mistaken, with the party, being active in the party, it's also slightly higher than among female respondents. So still, it's I have not compared with through the time, so from 2019 to 2020 and 2021. by gender. But I think that we could expect the differences there as well due to COVID and due to the outcomes of COVID to people, to women and to men in terms of their economic activity and access to jobs in Ukraine. So other studies show that the access to jobs declined because of COVID to women. And I think we might expect something that would contribute to that finding in these data in social capital measurement.
Thank you. And the first question Tamara put in after thanking you for the talk and the inspiring research you're doing is to think about your research as maybe a base for explaining agency, volunteering and protest of Ukrainians during the last 4 months after or since the invasion. Obviously that wasn't part of your research, but maybe if we also kind of broaden it and think, I mean, maybe going on from now, sort of how do you perhaps intend to link it or to see if there are these links, if there's a sort of a certain build up to the amount of volunteering and protesting we see even amidst the most difficult circumstances?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's quite interesting to try to link it to the full-scale war that we are experiencing for the last more than 4 months. But as far as I had no questions about for example, protesting, or the questions that were specifically about the experience in being in the military, in the army, or taking part in the war activities in Donbass in the past. I'm not sure that I will be able to have any direct insights in that. But for example, in terms of accessing the economic resources, it is linked to the crowdfunding and volunteering, I would say. If we are talking on the other hand, if we are talking about the government communications and how different news messages are transmitted to the audiences, we also see that it's what is I think what is here in the data, and I actually draw attention to that, is that people actually do not have a lot of ties to journalists and to editors. So it means that they are not they do not have the perception, the understanding of how, for example, pick up the news, how to perceive the news, how to work with the information. And that is actually also concluded by the study conducted by Detector Media. I don't know whether some of our attendees or the wider audience know about this NGO. So Detector Media conducted the study of media literacy last year in 2021, and they actually did it in a very interesting way. They clustered the sample, the population poll sample, the nationwide sample, to the categories of those who are media literate in a good way. So we have the high level of media literacy, the medium level of media literacy, and the lower level of media literacy. And I think that if we would combine that with this kind of data that I obtained in my survey, we see that if people would have someone in their surrounding who might explain them in a simple language how to work with the media news, with the information, they might rise up the media literacy level. Maybe, I don't know, it might be one of the instruments how to increase that. But how to arrange that, that's also an a question, an open question, because from my knowledge, this sphere is also like a bubble, just like the sphere in anti-corruption research, in the other topics. So where people who work actively in this sphere, they know each other, but this community, the professional community, is quite close to some kind of the external interactions with the wider public. So how to make these professional communities more close to wider public? Like with sociology, it has been done through this public sociology notion. Yes, when sociologists speak to wider public in a simple language, but how to make it with the media or with the CSOs, for example, who work in anti-corruption domain, that's still, I think, to be done.
Thank you. Larissa is asking whether your research included the interaction between the size of one's network and interpersonal trust, because the number of resources an individual extracts from the network and from the ties can also be a function of how trustworthy this individual is, and this could predict the likelihood of using these ties or creating new ties.
Yeah, I think that for the next waves, if they will be possible to be conducted, it's worth adding the scale on assessing the level of trust to each tie, but maybe not only the trust, but also the let's say to what extent the respondent believes that this resource can be mobilized in a, for example, efficient way or in a quick way. Yes. That's one thing, and I see that Victoria is also writing about the in-depth interviews. That is, I think, what will be the next step, and that is something that can be combined with what Larissa is suggesting, with this trust and with the reliability of the information resource, for example, or the sustainability of the connections, how people evaluate them in their ego network. So that is something that is to be done in the in-depth interviews, of course. And in order to make it in a proper way, I will still need to define which categories to cover in the in-depth interviews, because with the population sample, it's, I would say, easy because it's very diverse, and you have all the age categories, you have men and women in this population sample, you have people of different regions and settlement types and the occupations and everything. But with the in-depth interviews, of course, it's necessary to make it with a proper design on how to select the audiences for the key informants. So I think that if to narrow it to a certain category, for example, to, I don't know, to the youth, for example, or to just to people in the big cities, that's that might be a bit simpler than just to cover all the population categories in in-depth interviews.
Yeah, maybe another way could also be to select interviewees by the type of resources you're most interested in. No?
Yeah, that's also an option.
Because I was also thinking sort of in a way related to that, because I liked it a lot how you broke down this really big and I think possibly also overused term of social capital into these actual resources, what's behind that. So then I think it becomes kind of easier again to grasp something concrete, but then it also raises or leaves, I suppose, the question, well, what happens with these resources? No, these resources could be there in existence. Is that what we mean by social capital? And if something happens, maybe they will be activated or maybe not. Or is the argument really sort of we want to understand them, what happens when they get activated? No, when do these resources matter, in what situations, and what follows then, and how one would actually research that methodologically? I was going to ask you, but maybe you've sort of with these interviews you've already given a bit of an idea of that, because that's quite tricky, you know. Although, I mean, by going sort of to resources, I think you've already gone in a very important step to make this sort of concrete. But then what comes next, and what these resources actually, how do they then matter when they matter?
Actually, what was my idea was that the longitudinal research is here helpful, because when we look at the same respondent in different waves, we can actually ask about not only the perception of the resource and the connection, but we also can ask whether this kind of connection was mobilized to reach this resource in the past time. For example, if these waves of the survey are conducted annually, once a year. But yeah, this was an idea kind of boiling in my head prior to the full-scale invasion, and it's on hold now. And hopefully it's, well, something to be implemented further. Yeah, so
probably one bigger change will be sort of a really expanded notion of what volunteering means, no? And if people might not even think about it as volunteering, but as sort of maybe what other surveys have also tried to tap into in terms of duty, no? So your duty to engage in different types of activities, clearly will be important going forward. I don't currently see any more questions or comments, so I'll use the opportunity to kind of ask something else, because on this question also, does it help to explain what's happening now and the dynamics of volunteering or mobilization inside society. And I suppose ideally you need more data going back in time, because I thought, and I wonder if there are then maybe through other surveys, at least in parts, that you can capture this, because I read your research on the resources from 2019 to 21 as a relatively stable picture. I mean, there were some smaller exceptions maybe, but then, as you yourself said, maybe that's hard to link kind of the expertise in football. Where does that then go? I don't know. I look forward to that argument, how that plays out. But then if everything else is sort of moving slightly, but not too much, then that still, I think, leaves sort of a bigger gap, not to explaining something that I think also other surveys have shown, that there was, I mean, over years, something building which isn't captured by membership in organizations, but this notion of being engaged or having to engage, I think is even during the Corona pandemic. I looked at some data comparing it also or looking briefly at comparisons to other countries. That's not really what we see in the pandemic, what we see it in Ukraine. So I think there was something building, and I think maybe it, however, built before 2019. If we look at the resources, I don't know. I wonder how you think about that.
Well, again, I mean, talking about this specific instrument, it's hard to, I mean, this resource generator, it's hard to be applied in a retrospective view. So in order to have this time series for many waves, or with this period of time that was for World Value Survey in 2011-2020, we need that the time passes and we compare the data, for example, with the 10 years gap, or like with ISSP, there was a wave in 2009 and 2019. And well, it's again, still the data that I'm in the process of analyzing in the ISSP, but with the passing time, I would expect more changes to be observed, and maybe with the effect of the full-scale war, it would be also the mobilization of social capital and different resources. But as well, I think many colleagues would point out, for the surveys that are conducted now, it's well, the surveys that are conducted on the samples that well, here I would go deep into methodological aspects. So when we have we have now the data on how the population structure changed since February 24. And until we'll have a clear understanding of that, it would be including the internal displacement, external the displacement, the war refugees to outside Ukraine, the flows between the settlements. The surveys are showing the attitudes, for example, to the war or to the different scenarios of how to resolve the war and etc. But with this kind of survey on social capital, that would be, I think, what I would need, I guess, is that the sample structure would be comparable, and I still questioning myself how to make it with the survey. If, for example, include this kind of question to the August or September wave of the omnibus, and if it would actually be possible to include. So I don't know actually whether I will have the 2022 wave, and well, hopefully with the. So what is the solution methodologically is to start this longitudinal the panel data. Panels data collection, and to address it, for example, once half a year or once a year, and then to have this data back to 2022, 5 years after. So, but that's always good to have this, you know, research questions and research ideas, and to come back to them some years after, like 5 or 10 or 15 years after.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I didn't mean adding exactly the same questions sort of about sort of having people individually look back, but whether in other surveys, sometimes there might be maybe questions about the specific type of resource you were asking about.
Yeah, that's ISSP. That's ISSP. It has some of the resources, like the connections to the governmental, to the person in the government, or the person in the like public authority employee, the person who works in that sphere, or the person who works in the for-profit organization. So certain resources are available in this ISSP dataset from 2009 and 2019, but not, of course, the full list of resources.
Absolutely, yes. So Heiko is going back to what we discussed a few minutes ago. He says, I think the fact that the number of those claiming to have people lend them substantial sums of money has increased during the pandemic might show that people only know what they can get from their contacts once they've actually asked for it. So if people have a more pessimistic view of their contacts, they may underestimate the support they could get, while others might overestimate it. So would this produce a bias in your data? And is there any way to avoid this apart from in-depth interviews? Heiko apologizes for the long question, but I think there's no need for that. It's a very good question.
So just give me 1 second to read it out.
Read it, yes.
Yes. So with the access to certain resources, for example, the lending of considerable sum of money, or the other types of information, like who among the surrounding earns like more than 50,000 hryvnias. I think it's definitely relates to the let's say knowing your surrounding better during pandemic. So that means that people actually explored their ego networks, and it's one thing. And I do not actually get the notion on the bias, maybe because it's hard to read in the chat.
I think, I mean, it's about if you ask people, would others give them money that they over and underestimated? But I think that's not how the question was posed, right? It was more if they know people who have financial resources.
Yeah.
So it's more about
so
information. It's not assessing whether people would give you the money, right?
Yeah, it's not that. So the question was quite simple. So whether you have anyone in your surrounding who might provide the access to to each of these resources in the list, each of the 19 resources, and if yes, then pick up who is that? Is that your relative? Is that your friend? Is that your acquaintance or a neighbor? And if a respondent answers no, none is in my surrounding in the capacity of providing this kind of resource, then the none option is picked up. So it's not, I think here we already have this perception by the respondent whether this resource can be mobilized. So if I know that someone earns, let's say, more than 50,000 hryvnias per month, but I know that I cannot borrow from that person. I cannot get money from that person on my, I don't know, needs or any kind of purpose. I would not match this in my perception that in both types of resources, I pick up, for example, this, I think about these alter among my surrounding. So I can pick up that, yes, I have someone, for example, a relative who earns more than 50,000, but now I have no one to borrow me a considerable sum of money. So that means that in my perception, I already assess that as the capacity to borrow this money from a certain person.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think we're slowly running out of time, and I don't see any more questions or comments for the moment. So I'd just like to thank you again, Tetiana, for sharing your very interesting research and also methodologically interesting research with us today. We will make this lecture available on our ZOiS website and on YouTube as before. But for now, thank you very much, Tetiana. But let me also briefly tell you what's on next week. For our last lecture in this series, we'll have Dr. Yulia Bidenko from Karasin Kharkiv National University, who will talk to us about how Ukraine was underestimated, decentralization, EU integration, and digitalization. But we will leave that for next week, and we'll thank you again, and goodbye.